This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April the 3rd, 2018, the RCMI hosted a Defense and Security Studies Roundtable on the management of hostage situations. Our guests were Mr. Andy Ellis, former Assistant Director of Operations with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and now CEO of the ICEN Group, and retired Lieutenant Colonel Steve Day, former Commanding Officer of JTF-2 and now President of Reticle Ventures Canada.
Director, Deputy, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight. One more. This is a very interesting question, and this quote really strikes me at the core of this. Kidnapping in the 21st century is a dilemma. Like a lot of the things in the security and intelligence world, it's not black and white. Rather, it's shades of gray. What the right thing to do and what the wrong thing to do isn't entirely clear, and changes as you move forward in the process. And it's interesting because Steve and I not only worked together on various cases around the world while we were both with Her Majesty's government, but we've actually worked on a couple of cases since then. And it strikes me about how difficult this can be and how challenging it can be. But I'm hoping that the lesson that we take out of this is just that this is shades of gray, that there needs to be nuance, that you need to understand and appreciate how events change, how events evolve, and that we all need to be flexible and capable enough to respond to them. Here are some of the facts. There are more than 20,000 people kidnapped every year. Vast proportion of those cases are settled very quickly and very quietly by private sector organizations, by their employers, by their families, without it ever becoming public that this incident took place. In a small minority of cases where the government is involved, that's where you get the interaction with and the involvement of the government at various different levels, whether it be in Canada, municipal authorities, provincial authorities, or the federal authorities in Canada and abroad protecting Canadians. Just to give you an idea, last year there were 396 kidnappings in Brazil, 296 kidnappings in Chile, 701 kidnappings in Peru, and an untold number in Nigeria. Kidnaps for ransom are very different. People kidnap for very different reasons, and then it evolves often. What you see in the more recent times is people will get kidnapped by one group and they will upsell that individual, that group of individuals, to another group. It often goes from a group of local thugs, and once they realize the value of someone, they upsell them to a terrorist organization who can demand everything from concessions to vast amounts of money. I think, the classic example of how things have changed is you look at Terry Waite. In the mid-1980s, Mr. Waite was kidnapped by Hezbollah, and directly by Hezbollah, and he was held for a very, very long time with a bunch of others, and eventually released. Some of his colleagues were murdered by Hezbollah, but that was a direct political thing. That was in order to get concessions, and money played a very small role in it. What you see more recently is a kind of a hybrid, weird kidnapping situation where, again, you'll get captured by thugs, you'll get moved from the thugs to the terrorist organization, and then the terrorist organization tries to get release of their brethren, some sort of other concessions, and often money. I think the classic example of that is the Fowler Gay Kidnapping that took place in West Africa not too long ago. I'm not going to say whether a ransom was paid for Mr. Fowler and Mr. Gay, because thank God I don't know. But there have been, if you look at Latin America and West Africa and a lot of parts of Asia, there are kidnappings. It is entirely a business undertaking. Kidnappings are taking place entirely to make money. And I think a classic example is Corinne Coffin. Corinne Coffin was the heir to the Pepsi empire and was kidnapped in Brazil, eventually injured in the rescue attempt by Brazilian authorities. So these things have changed, and again it goes back to the shades of gray. The involvement of different terrorist organizations has changed. The way they hold people has changed. Communication systems have changed. And most recently, the ICEN Group worked on on a kidnapping in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the organization is both a terrorist organization and arguably a criminal kidnapping organization at the same time. So when you're negotiating with these people, you need to understand what their motivations are. And their motivations may change, their motivations evolve, and their motivations as an organization change depending on who's in charge. Another big area that we won't talk about much today is express kidnapping. Express kidnapping, or ATM kidnapping, is the most common kind of kidnapping in the world today. It's also among the most dangerous types of kidnapping. You know, very quickly, you're kidnapped on your way to or from, usually from the airport to the hotel, or from your hotel to a restaurant. You're taken to an ATM machine, told to empty it, and they hold you over until after midnight, and they have you do it again. They often take you to your hotel in between to take your valuables in between. The threat of serious injury is very, very high because they have no patience. These people are extremely ruthless. It's all about volume. So they're not just going to kidnap the richest and most, wealthy looking people. That's their number one target. But they're going to take middle class people because it's all about one after the other, after the other, after the other. I'll show you a little bit of the modus operandi, but express kidnappers, they're organized, they work in teams, they work in groups. One of the classic ways that they undertake their operations, if any of you people have ever traveled on business and you're met at the airport on the other end and they're holding up the sign that says Mr. Smith, CEO of ABC Incorporated, that's probably the worst thing you could possibly do. The first thing they do is they sit at the airport and they look at those signs, and then they pick up their smartphone and they Google who you are, and then on the way from the airport to your residence, they're going to ambush you. And they're going to take what you can. Oftentimes, the individual who's holding the sign for you has already been corrupted into supporting these individuals. Again, the target vehicle is hijacked, and people are often injured, even for sport, in these types of kidnappings. This next one gives you a flavor for some of the most well-known kidnappings that have taken place in the last decade. And again, Steve and I have worked on some of these together in places like Iraq and Africa, East Africa, West Africa. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. There have been hundreds and hundreds of custodial kidnappings, both in Canada and taking oftentimes Canadian children abroad from one spouse to another. But there's also been, I would suggest, dozens and dozens of executives for private firms, mining companies, resource companies, financial firms who've been kidnapped. And as I said before, the kidnappings are resolved fairly quietly and fairly effectively through the intervention of the private sector experts who understand what the needs and requirements are for the people holding them, and also through the families, unfortunately. But these end quickly, and they tend to end relatively safely because it's a money-making venture. They don't want to be killing too many of the people that they're grabbing. It brings too much pressure onto them. Just a couple of headlines that you've probably seen in the last little while. We're talking Ecuador, Africa, Middle East, you name it, there's kidnappings taking place, and you name it, Canadians are being kidnapped. And again, what I can suggest to you is that this is the tip of the iceberg of the number of Canadians that are kidnapped in foreign locations, notwithstanding which takes place in this country. Some of these cases are a little higher profile than others. I think all of you will recognize these people that are in this photograph. Our company was brought in 4.5 years into this kidnapping case to help to resolve it. We engaged people in the Middle East, South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere to influence the kidnappers that it's in their best interest to release this family. We engaged American authorities, Canadian authorities, Pakistani authorities to see if we could create a situation where a rescue could take place. This is probably one of the very first times that the private sector and the public sector in this country have worked together on a kidnapping and abduction case of this scale. And I would argue that for the most part it worked pretty well. When I was first brought in, I would attend meetings between the Boyle family and the Canadian government, only because, as you can imagine, when your family member, your loved one has been kidnapped, you're not in a really good position to manage your emotions and to understand what's being said to you. So at first we started out being basically translators of bureaucracies to English so that the family could understand what was being told to them. And I can even suggest that, having been through it now in a domestic context, because it worked out really well. I don't know how many times I would say, no, that's not what they said to you. Don't worry, that's not what they said, that's not what they meant. And putting things into context, I think, takes a lot of the stress and the pressure off the family. It's someone they can turn to who doesn't have a vested interest somewhere else. Their entire vested interest is with the family. There's been a lot of success in the United Kingdom using this model. In a law enforcement context, you'll have the family liaison officer. But what's been happening in the Canadian context is the victims' families feel like the liaison officer is working for law enforcement before they're working for them, or working for policy before they're working for them. It's kind of finding someone in between who kind of has a foot in both camps. That evolved into, as I said earlier, into a lot more operational role as the case went forward, because we saw opportunities there that weren't available to some of our colleagues. And I can't get into a lot of the details, but I can say that in dealing with our law enforcement partners on this case, there were things that we were doing and people that we were engaging that for all sorts of policy and political reasons, they couldn't. And that worked out well, because we shared everything we had with law enforcement and didn't expect the same. And I think that's a mature way of moving forward in the future, of finding some sort of balance. The only thing that we asked is if Paul Thorne or myself or someone else is abroad and we're in danger, that someone will give us a heads up, because I bleed a lot, and I'm a coward. But I thought it was really important that we developed the nature of that relationship between us, and I think that worked out really, really well. I'll very, very quickly talk to you about the duty of care. The duty of care in Canada, most people don't know about this, and after the West Rain mine disaster, we've all been through it, health and safety issues in the office. You have to take an online course. You have to make sure you have ergonomic chairs. You have to make sure your books don't fall off the shelf and break your neck. But that mines are shored up so they don't collapse and all these other things. But what most people don't realize is that if you have more than 5 employees and your employees are traveling on behalf of your company, you are supposed to train them on how to travel safely, effectively, and more importantly, train them on the destination to which they are to travel, to make sure that when they get there, they know how to comport themselves. And finally, you need to have some sort of mechanism, a plan in place to get them out if something goes wrong. What changed in the last couple of years was it's been codified in criminal law. So directors of a company, again, if you have more than 5 employees, are really a gigantic risk right now, and most Canadian companies are in non-compliance. Because if one of your employees gets hurt overseas on travel status, yes, they can sue you like they used to. And we've talked to a lot of senior business personnel, my insurance will cover it. It will, but they won't go to jail for you, because the directors of companies are now liable for criminal offenses and can be brought before criminal courts and face criminal sanctions. So, it's really important. It's actually been tested before the courts that if you have employees who are traveling on your behalf, it's really important to be able to train them and expose them how to travel safely, effectively. And, arguably, as we said, mitigated risk equals opportunity. Some of the companies that we're dealing with right now, say, we can't go to Yemen, we can't go to Nigeria. And we've talked to them and said, let us train you, and maybe you can. Maybe you can go where your competitors can't. So it's looking at a different way of approaching this problem, but times have changed and the risk has changed. This is a tragic case. It moves me just to talk about it. And this is I chose this as as sort of a cornerstone for what we wanted to talk about today. But Kayla Mueller was a lovely young lady who tried very, very hard to help people around the world in all sorts of different ways. She had a boyfriend, she was in Turkey, she had a boyfriend who was in Médecins Sans Frontières. She traveled with him across the border to Aleppo. When she arrived in Aleppo, you could imagine the Médecins Sans Frontières people being a little shocked that she had shown up. What the hell are you doing here in the middle of a war zone? And they tried to get her out of the country. They didn't have their own transport, they didn't have their own, so they claim, capability to get her out. So they took her to a bus station, and you can imagine what happened. She and her Syrian-born boyfriend, who was an MSF employee, and 3 others were kidnapped. It became a tragic and terrible incident. What happened was Médecins Sans Frontières has a responsibility to their own employees. And I'll say here, Médecins Sans Frontières paid a rather substantial ransom, and all of their employees came home safely. In Kayla's case, her family remained in the United States, and they did what all of us would do. They turned to the government of the United States and said, help me. And the government did all they could do under the laws that were in place and the policies that were in place at the time to render assistance to her. But they were restricted from doing certain things. Paying a ransom, talking about paying a ransom, moving money, engaging in providing some sort of concessions to a listed terrorist organization. And it got worse. The U.S. military special forces in July 2014 were going in to do a raid and a rescue of James Foley, who, God rest his soul, was also killed by the Islamic State. And they were unsuccessful in getting Mr. Foley, but when they got there, they found that on the cell walls there was handwriting, and an analysis of the handwriting and what was said made it abundantly clear that it was Kayla who was held in that facility. One of the interesting questions, and this goes back again to, I'll come back to this, to the dilemma in the shades of gray. It was an audacious, courageous, and brave undertaking that the U.S. military did to try and rescue Foley and to try and rescue Kayla as well. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But, you know, what is the cost of a failed rescue? In this case, it was very, very bad. Kayla suffered horribly because they weren't successful in rescuing her, and they felt that the rescue attempt was to free her. I will say that, and I was talking to Steve about it earlier, having worked a number of kidnapping cases, and a lot of the ones that you saw up on the screen before, if I were kidnapped tomorrow, please come and try and rescue me. I don't care what the impact is going to be, because in our case in Canada, you're going to be there for a while. If you know, and you need, part of the training is you need to understand that 3 days into your misadventure, no one's coming through the jungle to rescue you. Steve's former colleagues it's going to take a long time. The political things that need to come to bear, the operational things that need to come there, you can just imagine. And it's hard to explain to people that you're going to have to hunker down and survive. You're going to have to learn to brush your teeth. You're going to have mental fitness and physical fitness and move forward. Again, I would want to be rescued, but at the same time, you need to understand, again, I talked to you about the numbers. You're talking about 3 of 20,000. The likelihood of you being rescued is very, very small. Some of the people that were held by the Sendero Luminoso in South America were held for 3 to 5 years, just on money, simple money issues. And the question is, pay or not to pay? In August 2015, Kayla Mueller was forced to marry the Daesh Emir Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Not only was she married to al-Baghdadi, but she was brutalized by many other senior members of Daesh. She was American, and they were also saying that every time they phoned her family, an FBI agent answered the phone claiming to be her father and refusing to pay a ransom. Understand that the Daesh people had just gotten ransoms for everybody who got kidnapped with her. They were angry, they were frustrated, and I got an American woman here who I can exploit. And they did. The family had suggested strongly to the American government that they make an exchange, because this was one of the offers that was put forward for a Daesh, female Daesh commander, for want of a better term. But the U.S. government refused to make that trade. It's perfectly reasonable, and the brutalization continued. Carl Mueller, her father, expressed huge frustration with the Obama administration for what they were doing. A couple of the quotes: we understand the policy about not paying ransom, but on the other hand, any parents out there would understand that you would want anything and everything done to bring your child home. I think all of us could say that. If my child, I can tell you, were kidnapped in any part of the world, I would do anything and everything, from paying a ransom to making concessions to making noise on Parliament Hill to doing whatever I needed to do, to hiring people to do anything to bring my loved ones home. I understand the frustration, but you understand as well the administration's responsibility to manage the payment of ransom so as to not encourage more kidnappings. And then he went on to say, and we tried and asked, but they put policy in front of American citizens' lives, and it hasn't changed. This is a fascinating quote where he says, United States Secretary of State John Kerry said, look, this is no one's to blame here but the Islamic State. And he's right. He's absolutely right. The Islamic State did the kidnapping. Nobody else did. They're the heinous people here. They're the enemy. But at the end of the day, we all need to step back and say, notwithstanding that, what's the right answer? What's the right answer to bring people to freedom? Is it finding some sort of negotiated settlement? Is it holding to a hard line of never negotiating with terrorists? Is it having family members do it and having the government distance themselves from that? If you've read any of the books of the mother of a released kidnapped victim, wrote a book, Lorinda Stewart, recently, and she talked about how a decision was made halfway through her daughter's incarceration in Somalia that the RCMP pulled out and said, well, you're going to have to do it yourself. And understand what the RCMP was doing. They were trying to distance themselves because it got into the passage of money, and they weren't allowed to be part of that conversation. So not even in the back room, not even beside her, they had to leave. And she was left to negotiate for her own child on her own. And I would strongly recommend reading Lorinda's book, but you can actually listen to the tapes online of her having these conversations with Al-Shabaab. It's heart-wrenching. That's an awful lot to leave on a citizen. That's a huge amount of pressure to put on the mother of a child to negotiate for her release as they're beating her. It's just Andy talking. I don't think it's the right answer. I don't think that's the way to do it. I think that the government and experts need to be there to help, and we need to find a middle ground to be able to help without crossing that policy line. This is really interesting. In the Daily Mail, a former FBI negotiator said, sometimes you can pay a ransom if you do something with it. And what he was talking about is you can beacon the money, for example, and if you can track where the money goes, then that's an advantage, an operational, tactical, strategic advantage to where you were before. You know where the terrorists are, you know where it's going, you know where the vast proportion of the funds go, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue that I think he's absolutely right. Add to that, the French, in about 2003, two of their citizens were kidnapped. They paid a lot of euros to get them free. And then, strangely enough, this drone happened to be flying over the guys who had the euros, and this thing came out of the drone, and they went boom, and money was flying. And there's a great video of it, actually, of euros flying in the air. People got home safely, and the bad guys didn't. Sometimes you can be creative. Mr. Obama said, it's tough as anything I've ever had to do, having the conversation with parents who understandably want by any means necessary for their children to be safe. We will do everything we can short of providing an incentive for future Americans to be caught. I go back to that railway that you saw at the beginning, the dilemma. What do? It's the balance between helping the family and helping future families, to deny future families. Statistically, as much as we all argue it will encourage more terrorism, unfortunately so many countries pay that those of us who don't find our citizens at more risk. In the Canadian context right now, we had a discussion, I won't say classified because it's now public sector, but we had a conversation with some people in Afghanistan who were involved in kidnappings. And what they said to us was very disturbing, because they said, on the one hand, you've got the Europeans. They don't kidnap people based on their nationality. They kidnap people based on opportunity. Here's a whole bunch of people that look like they're affluent Westerners. I'm going to grab them and figure out who they are later. And then you start to divide them up. In this camp are the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Italians, the Spanish, Portuguese, who pay ransom. They're a valuable commodity. Over here are the Americans and the British who don't pay ransom, but they retaliate. If I do something to their citizens, something's going to happen to me. We're going to have to pay a price for this. So that's a consideration I have to keep in mind. And what this member of the Taliban told us was, then there's the Canadians. They don't pay ransoms, but they don't retaliate. And he shrugged. I don't know what that means, but I took it to mean we're expendable. So we have to find something. We have to find something to either pay covertly pay, work between private and public sector to find some sort of resolution to this thing, or use our military capability to bring some sort of penalty to those who are doing it. Law enforcement as well. Washington Post, U.S. government, after the Kayla Mueller situation, she was killed. She was decapitated by the Islamic State. And if you ever watched the 2020 documentary, I strongly recommend it. It talks about her mother and father who couldn't resist and watched their own child be decapitated in it. But President Obama watched it too. And they made some decisions that I think are courageous and brave, innovative, and creative. What they said was at this news conference, where you can see the spokesman for the Obama administration talk, says, "We will not abandon families in their greatest time of need. We do not intend to add to families' pain in such cases by suggesting that they could face criminal prosecution for advancing the interest of a terrorist group. There has been a significant shift in hostage takings by terrorist organizations." So a recognition that things have changed since the days of the PFLP-GC and PFLP and PLO and other Palestinian organizations. And finally, we must evolve to take into account this new reality. So they're saying, I recognize the change, and we need to evolve in order to take account of that reality. Pressure mounted on the administration to make some changes. The FBI came out and said, look, we help families. We're not supposed to, but we do it anyway. And you might have seen some media coverage recently from the RCMP basically saying the same thing. But I can tell you in a couple of cases that we've worked on in the ICEN Group as well as Reticle, when it came down to the crunch, the RCMP was not in a position to legally provide some of the things that we needed. One of them was, well, can you help us to talk to the terrorists? No, because you're talking about concessions. Okay, then I guess we'll do that. Now a real challenge, I am limited to $9,999.99 to take out of the country. Can you help me get through CBSA? No. And don't tell me that you are. That's problematic. The FBI, on the other hand, actually moves money for American citizens. In the most recent case, we asked the FBI to do it for us. And our Canadian friends and colleagues said, good idea. We're in a jam. What does that tell you? So what did they change? White House spokesman Josh Earnest said that allowing private families to pursue ransom payments would not undermine the administration's policy of refusing to make payments at all. This is nuance. Too frequently, the suffering of families of hostages were left in the dark, unsure who in government was working exclusively to ensure the safe return home of their loved ones. If you look, Toronto Star did a whole series of reports, as did CBC in the end of 2016, and that's what Canadian families have been saying for the last half a decade. I don't know what's going on, no one's telling me what's going on, and they don't seem to be working at my interests. And finally, and I think this is in answer to a question, speaking generally, helping with a ransom payment, to use your word, is not tantamount to paying a ransom. And I think that's extremely well said. I think that's a very mature way of dealing with it, and that's the American government policy, contrary to our own right now, about we can't do it, we shouldn't do it, but we're going to help other people do it. What the difference is, if the government is involved in a negotiation, this is proven fact, the amount of money that's going to be exchanged is 100-fold more than you would if it was a private exchange. Secondly, no one expects a private citizen to grant concessions. You can't. I'm working on behalf of Jane Doe's parents. They don't expect you to get people released from prison. They don't ask you to, because they know you can't. They do ask the government to. So in some cases, and this is discussions we've had with the Canadian government, maybe that's the way to do it. Maybe someone else speaks to the bad guys. Someone else says, well, this is the most I can do. These people are second mortgaging their house. They don't have Fort Knox to lean on to bring out hundreds of millions of dollars to pay you. And I think the Americans have realized some success in this. Mr. Hall and Mr. Ridsdale, as you might well remember, were kidnapped in the Philippines, and unfortunately were killed by their kidnappers. Hall's sister said that the federal government must reform a, quote, broken system. She then said, quote, somebody has got to get the ball rolling on reform, serious reform to our policies regarding Canadians in peril on foreign soil. We just don't have a plan to help them. We have some of the best experts in the world as far as terrorism, hostage taking, and hostage release and rescue. I just think we need to seriously look at this and fix a broken system and quit politicking about and quit letting the dull blade of bureaucracy allow people to die. That's an extraordinary comment. The dull blade of bureaucracy allowing people to die. I'm going to say something that's controversial and maybe it'll get some discussions going, but I believe this in my heart and soul. It was a very, very strong position during the Hall and Ridsdale's kidnappings that Canada will not pay a ransom. Included in that was the Prime Minister himself saying Canada will not pay a ransom during the kidnapping. Had ransoms been on the table as an option, that some sort of realization of the demands of the Abu Sayyaf group, who was one of those groups I talked about before, who was an amalgam of a terrorist group and an organized crime organization. Had that been on the table at the time, I believe Misters Hall and Ridsdale would be alive today. That's how serious this is. That's how serious having an understanding and appreciation of having all the tools available to you. The tools from government intervention to government response to negotiation at the government level, but all the way down to, I'm going to cut you a deal at the lowest level we possibly can to get people home. You recall that Prime Minister Trudeau said the brutal killings of 2 Canadian hostages held by Abu Sayyaf extremists in the Philippines were, quote, a low point for him in 2016. No offense, Prime Minister, but I think it was a lower point for the family. This is something that, I just wanted to raise this as a position to speak about, because it's a very emotional issue. The right answer is we don't pay ransoms, ever. That's not the best answer. I talked to you at the beginning the difference between moral decisions and ethical decisions. Some are black and white and some are shades of gray. And this is where we as Canadians fall right now. It's trying to find our place. It's trying to realize the best way forward. I think the Boyle case was a real good step forward because it amalgamated the private and public sectors together to try and find some sort of realization. It was successfully negotiated, but all of it outside of the bounds of acceptability that government allows to take place. Now, it worked because it was a good partnership between the private and public sector, but finding workarounds isn't the best way to keep people safe. Thank you.
That is a tough act to follow, Andy. Outstanding brief. Thank you very much. And what I would like to note, just for Andy and his business partner Paul, I also on the public safety side, the corporation side, I appreciate your leadership in the industry is trying to move this issue forward, because I do believe, like you, that we've got a broken system right now, and we as Canadians need to find a way forward on it. So thank you for the presentation. It's a great scene setter for what I hope will be an exchange of ideas going forward. And again, Paul, thank you very much for everything you guys have done behind the scenes. I'd like to also thank, obviously, Dan and Eric for inviting me here and being part of the panel. Very happy to be speaking on this issue with Andy. We have done a couple of things together, clearly while I was in uniform, and now commercially as well. So it's a great partnership, Andy and Paul, and I hope to continue doing things going forward in the future. But for Dan and Eric and the members and the committee for the National Security and Defense Studies here at the RCMI, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to be relatively brief in my comments. I've got three kind of themes I'd like you to consider, because I'm keen to have a dialogue back and forth about my experiences partnered up with those other national security actors and why we did or did not prosecute some of these hostage release operations, and how difficult they can be. So I'm looking at this from a practitioner's perspective. I'm looking at this from the man who had to walk point with my brothers and sisters in Canadian Special Operations, within the law enforcement community in this country, and within the broader national security apparatus, including the intelligence and clandestine and covert services. We have some significant challenges in this country trying to safeguard Canadians when they are offshore. We have challenges trying to safeguard them inside our borders. It's just the nature of a very big country, limited resources, and we are stretched in every facet. So I would like to thank all the law enforcement in the room for walking point here domestically for keeping my family safe, because I know you guys have a thankless job, and I'm always honored to talk to you guys. So the three things I'd like to hit on, the realities from a practitioner of trying to prosecute a hostage release operation. And there are a couple of things we'll talk about there. The competing interests at play. Andy obviously hit on it a number of times, but I just want to highlight a few of those. And then lastly, what can we collectively do to help those individual Canadians and their families to be prepared? There are things that we can be doing to try and get in front of these issues. So those are kind of the three broad themes I'd like to hit on. So first, on the reality side. And again, I'm looking at this from a practitioner's perspective, having spent from 2001 pre-9/11 to when I retired or left JTF2 in 2011, pretty much involved in every national security incident or event in this country. I've been fortunate or unfortunate, depending on your perspective, to be sitting at the table as either a planner, a staff officer, or a commander, trying to resolve some of these very wicked challenges with limited resources, and quite frankly, from my perspective, a lack of political will to get on with it. It's not necessarily the bureaucracy, it's not necessarily the men and women who are doing those jobs. Most of the time, it's been a lack of political will. And occasionally, that lack of political will has been enabled by a lack of or risk-adverse senior bureaucrats who are not willing, in some cases, to put that Team Canada out the door, to let us to try and go out there and save these people who are in horrific situations. It is certainly not a lack of will on the people walking point. I will guarantee you that. So I want to just put that as a reality. So what are we talking about when we talk about hostage release? These are, as you know, I'm sure I'm speaking to or preaching to the choir, extremely high-risk events. They are high-risk operations. There is massive political risk, there is massive tactical risk, and you don't get any do-overs. You get a chance to do this once. And if you screw it up for whatever reason, anywhere along the spectrum, unfortunately someone is going to die. And as we've seen just recently with the FBI down in the States, they try to do a domestic kidnap release. And unfortunately, the FBI end up shooting the person who was kidnapped. It's just the nature of the game. It is extremely high risk. It requires speed and surprise on the objective, which must be enabled by good intelligence. And without good intelligence on the front end, we're just jacking the risk up for those men and women that are going in there to try and prosecute the operation. And that intelligence means ground truth. It's not pure intelligence, but it's actually ground truth, knowing the domain. We talked about Risdale and Holland trying to conduct a PhD level hostage release halfway around the globe. When there is a lack of political will, there is a lack of risk acceptance at the national bureaucratic level, because we should be trying to do better. We can be doing better. Canada is a first world nation. And when we put Canadians out in that space, they will surprise us each and every time because of how great they are and how our colleagues view us as being great. And I would offer that across all sectors of Canadian society. We just look at the world differently. So that's the realities of it. And I've sat around those tables and we've laid out plans and said, this is what it's going to take to at least attempt that rescue. It's doable. Is there risk? Of course there's risk. Do we need to cash some chips here and call in some allies and some favors? Absolutely. But it is possible if, and stealing Andy's words, we want to be a little bit audacious, a little bit courageous, to go out there and try. Because I'd rather try and fail than to be stuck there sitting on the sideline with that family going, we just couldn't get out the door. And that's what we have seen to date. Competing interests. And some of these competing interests are truly mutually exclusive. Some of them are not, but a lot of them are. When I'm talking about competing interests, clearly the family and the individual has got a dog in the fight. The duty of care agent, whether that is the Government of Canada or a corporation, whoever has put that individual, if they're there as the employer, has put them out in that space. there is a duty of care to take care of that person if they happen to find themselves on the wrong side of a pistol or whatever that might be in terms of a kidnapping. The other actor in this is the insurance companies, whether that be with K&R insurance or just your own life insurance, but they have certainly a competing interest to try and get you home as cheaply as possible. And then lastly, there are the security actors, whether it be private industry, whether it be the national security apparatus, whether it be local and municipal law enforcement. All those security actors are trying to resolve a challenge that is a wicked challenge. And if we don't align interests, it is extremely hard to prosecute that hostage release. So when I'm talking about conflicts of interest, we in CANSOF, or formerly Canadian Special Operations, we used to say time equals options. The sooner big decisions are made, the more tactical maneuver space we have on the ground. What we did not realize often is that the politicians, and I'm not beating on the politicians as a theme here, but the politicians hear that time equals options completely differently than the security actors. What they hear is, the longer I wait to make a decision, the more political options I have. And we've learned that lesson hard in Canadian Special Operations twice. And we never had to learn it again a third time. We had to learn it twice the hard time. We were talking time equals options. They were hearing, hey, I got time to make a decision later on, which was fascinating. Duty of care, so that is the frictions at play here, time equals options. We need time to figure out what's going around, as Andy was mentioning, to get the forces arrayed in the space, to allow the negotiators to set conditions for tactical success, or ideally, free the person who's kidnapped. But you need time, and you need to enable those men and women to do their job. So mutually exclusive here is the family. They clearly want their loved one released as soon as possible. Clearly the person that's being held wants to be released as soon as possible. But we have learned from a Canadian perspective, notwithstanding the years in some cases, these things are going to take a minimum 3 months to 6 months to even start to shape the solution. It's a 3 to 6 month window to try and shape that. What we need to appreciate on this side, depending on where you happen to be grabbed, most people, most healthy people, can probably survive 4 to 6 months under significant duress. That's if they have no underlying health issues. So we've got this tension between needing to get an intelligence, needing to set conditions, and a human, and how long they can survive in the environment. And so these are factors from a military planner, from a commander, as we're trying to manage risk, that we're conscious of. The insurance companies, again, whether it be K&R or simple life insurance, as cheap as possible. At the end of the day, they don't want to pay if unfortunately you get killed, and they don't want to pay, or they want to pay as little as they can to secure your release on the K&R side. And so this is where I'll talk to next. There's a bit of a conflict of interest I think we need to have a mature discussion around. The security actors. I'll use the royal we want to be as efficient and safe as we can in the prosecution of that operation. And when I'm talking efficiencies, I'm specifically talking about resources. Tied to that is effectiveness. But the reality is, in most hostage rescue, it is a very light footprint. It's a very light footprint that's going to reach out overseas and touch a target and extract that person, that package, whatever that might be, off the exit. We need to be brutally efficient. And so by efficiency, we look at that through effectiveness, and we look at that through safety. We also want to make sure the money's in place to allow us to train to set those conditions. So it's not necessarily efficiency on a monetary side, it's efficiency in terms of the level of effort. And we also look at it generally from a risk to mission perspective. What is the risk to successfully prosecute this hostage release? What is the risk to our own troops, or those men and women who are going out there, who may be living somewhere for an extended period of time, who are going through that grind, that absolute grind where you're trying to save someone who's halfway around the world? And then lastly, clearly the risk to the person who's being held, because that is where the rubber really meets the road. If we misstep anywhere along the way, as Andy has alluded to, the consequence out the back end is that person is going to die. And hopefully not a horrific death, but as recent cases have shown us, And as Andy has more than capably explained, there are some horrific deaths that happen out there. This is why, from a Government of Canada perspective, from a Canadian perspective, we need to find a better way to help these people get themselves in harm's way. So conflict of interest. Big hand, small map. You clearly have the family, and then you have everybody else, and there's tension there. Because as Andy has talked about, the reality is the emotions with those families are through the roof because they want to secure their loved one at all costs. So there's automatically a tension between the family and law enforcement, the intelligence community, and special operations if they're in there, because from our side, we also want to safely rescue that hostage or that kidnapped victim, and we also want to prosecute them. Because that's part of our culture, is the adherence to rule of law. We're not mobs. We want to go out there and prosecute as best we can, as we try and set those conditions for that. So that tension between the family and the wider security apparatus is very palatable. So what I've found interesting over my career, as I've looked back on a number of the incidences, is that from a Government of Canada perspective, we seem to live in a world of quadrants. And we only really see at that grand strategic level 4 kind of broad options. Option number 1 and 2 is do nothing and don't let anybody else do something, or do nothing and try and help that third party do something. That's kind of option 1 and 2 from a Government of Canada perspective. Option 3 or 4 is do something and either do it alone, unilaterally as Canada, or do it in partnerships with our allies. And generally speaking, we trend to do something with allies because we don't have all the capabilities we required, or do nothing and allow somebody else to do it for us. And I think as Canadians in a first world country, we can absolutely do better in both of those cases and take the lead and try and bring a coalition around us to prosecute those operations and save our loved ones who are overseas. So I just think for context later on and to try and bound the problem, this has been my experience, and I'd be very interested in the opinions of folks in the audience who lived at the highest levels of governments longer than I did, and when they're having some of those big discussions around the table, how we parsed out the do nothing and don't let somebody do it, do nothing, let somebody else do it, or the do somethings. Because that is pretty much from where I sit, the way I've seen us deal with most of these major national security crises. And I can relate a story later on about a specific example on that. Lastly, again in the interest of time, because I'm very keen to have a dialogue back and forth, from families and individuals. And I think this is where we as Canadians we see the world through some rose-colored glasses. We're quite naive on the risks outside of our borders because we're fortunate to live in a tremendous society where we do not have, as a general rule, most of these challenges. And I realize, again, a lot of law enforcement in the room, you guys are dealing with these issues out there every day, or you're dealing with challenges every day. So I'm not downplaying those challenges that you guys deal with as a general rule. I'm talking about those big national security crises where we're trying to help someone who's offshore. So as a family or as an individual, and again, Andy hit on this, so I want to reinforce this point, I think we need to take ownership of our own personal safety. And that means we need to be smart when we travel outside these borders. Are we putting ourselves in harm's way? Are we putting our families through some type of grief? And are we putting the men and women who are going to work throughout the night, miss holidays, and go through training at the highest level at risk to come and save me at some point in time? I think we need to take ownership of those things, and we need to have that conversation with Canadians when they go out there and do some silly things occasionally, and maybe venture to places maybe we shouldn't be venturing to. And if we are going to do that, we should have the training. And as families, we should ask our loved ones, have you received training from a reputable firm that allows you to maneuver through that dangerous world? Have you done something as simple as an isolated persons report, an ISOPREP as we would call it, to allow us to get data, to allow law enforcement, the intelligence actors, and heaven forbid JTF2 ever needed to be in it, to glean specific information from you, from the phone conversations, the tapes, and all those things that travel back and forth when we're working a problem. A simple, called an ISOPREP, fills out a bunch of information with some duress codes, etc., to allow us to know how are you doing. Those are things that Canadians can do, and they can do on their own if they're aware of it. Secondly, get the proper insurance. Get the life insurance if you're going to travel. Buy the KNR insurance, and I realize some of that stuff is pricey. And check with your employer. Who has the duty of care? Who has the obligation, should you be out on behalf of somebody else to save you? Know what those facts are. They will just set yourself up. They will set your family up for success to have the hard negotiations with the security actors who are doing the best they can with, in some cases, their hands being tied. Find out and have the uncomfortable conversation with your employer. They're not going to want to tell you about K&R insurance. It's not in their interest to tell you about K&R insurance. But find out what the company policies are if you happen to be in the extractive industry, whatever industry you happen to be traveling the world in. The employer, especially if they're a multinational, multi-jurisdictional, big net worth company, almost guaranteed has got some type of K&R insurance. And you as an individual, if you're being put out there, you should have that knowledge. And then lastly, and I would argue this could be the most important thing, and I want to re-hit Andy's point. If you happen to find yourself or a loved one in that horrendous situation, you need to hire a third-party advocate who can do the translations, who can explain and remove the emotion away from it, and say, this is what's going on, this is why it's going on. And there are those firms that are out there. And I go back to Andy and Paul who are leading the charge. I think you could not be better served than Andy and Paul at ICEN Group to help you resolve some of these things as a third-party advocate. You need to have those people out there, and I think it's a conversation we need to have. So what I would like to do is just go back around to one point there and talk about the conflict of interest to end on this. I think if most people in this room were to go on and look at their K&R policies, and you look at what insurance agency is providing that K&R policy, and you look at who their preferred security actor provider is, there is a direct conflict of interest commercially in that space, because most of these are teamed up. Look at the insurance provider, look at the big national security or the security actors, and one will say you can only get our insurance if you use this security company. You can only use this security company if you have that insurance. That sounds like a closed loop to me. And that sounds like a dramatic conflict of interest. Who is looking after the company's interest and who is looking after the individual's interest? Nobody, except for the family. So that's what I'd like to leave the talk on, is this is another conversation we need to have in this country about taking care of Canadians, is why do we allow this closed loop, this blatant conflict of interest between the underwriters and the security actors without having a third party in there to say, that's a dumb idea. Or, no, we're not going to wait 6 months for you guys to keep playing this out because we want to drive down the K&R dollar figure. Because that's what's happening. It's a dialogue between them. Going, the longer we wait, the lower the rate goes. And the security actor is looking at it going, the longer we wait, it gives us more intelligence. I get that. It gives us more time to plan the operation. But there's got to be a line there somewhere where we cross that Rubicon where it's time to go now. Because we're starting to reach a point of diminishing returns. So that's the point I'd like to leave on. And I'm happy to take any questions at this point, or sit down and Andy and I can field some questions from the audience. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Andy.
Okay, so ladies and gents, the floor is yours. Two incredibly informative and emotional presentations. Yes, please.
Wow, that's a good start. Well, I think it's a known fact now that Sergeant Bergdahl committed a criminal offense in doing what he did. But at the end of the day, and this goes to any kind of kidnapping overseas, and I think our company has said this before, people are going to do stupid things. Steve brought up. People are going to do ridiculous, stupid, ill-informed, ill-conceived things. People go hiking in Afghanistan. People pretend they're reporters in East Africa with no training and get themselves in problems. But not unlike when you ski off the path and we come and rescue you nonetheless. Maybe we charge you for the rescue, as they do in Colorado. You know, maybe the answer is somewhere in between, that as a nation and as people and as human beings, we still have a responsibility to try and rescue those people. The real ethical question is, how far do I go? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. In a case like Canadian diplomats being kidnapped in West Africa, that was pretty clear. They were doing the right thing. They weren't, off the path of where they ought to be, and they're doing their job. That's one level of risk, and I'm sure Steve's people would go a long way to rescue those guys. And then there's the one that did something really, really, really risky and stupid, and am I willing to let my son, the soldier, die trying to rescue them? There is no right and wrong there. And Bergdahl, I think, is the classic example. Some families whose offspring were killed in trying to rescue him, especially early on in the case, are understandably devastated by it. Why should I go out and rescue this guy who's a deserter? Well, he's an American, and he's an American soldier, and we don't know the details yet. And these are those shades of gray decisions. I guess me personally, I would always lean toward doing all that you can to bring them safely home. If they were extraordinarily reckless, maybe you don't go all the way.
No, I'm happy to make a comment on that one too. And I guess my perspective on it would be, when we looked at the various challenges, it was, for the most part, irrespective of how they found themselves in that situation, our job was to go out and find a way to bring them back home. And so we would have a chat, and this is why when I talked earlier about risk to mission, risk to troops, and risk to that person, our job was to articulate risk back up the chain and let the chain, at whatever level, make the decision on whether the risk was worth the reward. I didn't get to make those calls. I just said, here's how we're going to do this. This is what it's going to take to do it right. And if we don't do it right, here's the risk of getting it wrong. And is it worth losing 25 highly trained men and women for this individual or not? Again, that's not a military call. It's a law enforcement who has the lead. It's a global affairs. It's the senior political machine, and that's the way we were always. When they say go, we'd have a discussion about the tactics of it, the risk of it, and then when we're told to go, it's time to ruck up and we go.
Please. Yes, please. Read.
Well, I guess I go back to the comments that both of you have made about how you do these things. Having had a little bit of exposure to this sort of problem. I think one of the problems we have here in Canada, and I think both of you in different ways have said it, the Canadian system is broken, and we have to do better. And I think that's certainly in part true. And in part, it's because different parts of the security apparatus in Canada have different views on how you do this. The military have some, the intelligence people have some views, the law enforcement community has views, and of course the political people have views. So getting together and agreeing on what is the right thing to do. I did hear some exhortations that we have to do better, so what should we do to do it better?
Director, I'd say you have a heck of a lot more than a little bit of experience in that, just for the record. He's done a lot. What can we do better? One of the things that has struck me over the years, and I go back to kidnappings in Afghanistan and Africa and Iraq, Nigeria, people made mistakes. People made errors. They were in places they ought not to have been at a time they ought not to have been there. I think first and foremost, the legislators have come out and done it, and the courts have done it. They said you have a legal responsibility and a duty of care to your employees to protect them, to train them, to expose them. I think if we were to have trained people better, exposed people better, and prepared people better, you'd probably be looking at about 10%. So at least you've lessened the volume. Because think back of those pictures that you saw on the screen. A lot of those people made horrendous decisions and were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not all of them, but some of them. If you're kidnapped at a mine that you happen to be running, well, maybe you could have done your security different, maybe you could have invested more. But understanding and appreciating how to keep yourself safe and how to manage the situation in which you're operating and understanding the environment that you're operating in,
I think that will go a long way. I think that there's more that can be done through the Global Affairs Department to be more active in pushing safety information to Canadians and forcing them through schools, through, you look at school trips, for example. How many of us have had high school kids go on those trips down to, Latin America or down to the Caribbean? They should be briefed before they go. University kids that are going on exchanges should be briefed and understand the environment they're working in. Some of the training is very, very basic. I mean, the example I give all the time is that the best weapon you can possibly carry with you when you travel is a rubber doorstop. When you go to your hotel room, go inside and kick it under the door. It's the safest thing you can do. It costs you 99 cents. It's a brilliant, extremely important. We need to expose more people and have better understanding. I think the other thing I would change is, and I was strongly hinting at it, is at least follow the American model where there's no threats to families who try and find a resolution in a different way, and that the law enforcement not only turns their heads to families trying to do it, but try and facilitate it. Because we know factually and statistically that of those 22,000 kidnappings last year, 21,999 were dealt with very quietly and effectively, and a small amount of money was passed. Does it still create kidnappings? Yes. But as long as 70% of the world pays, we got to be a little bit more nimble.
And sir, if I could add to that, because I agree, you would have a tremendous amount of experience working at that grand strategic level in Ottawa. I think one of the things we need to do in Ottawa is get serious about how we want to engage with the world when we put Canadians out there and have a standing response and not have it be ad hoc all the time. I cannot tell you how many meetings that I would go to and it was different people every second week. You cannot build and maintain shared situational awareness on an issue if every second week is somebody new at the table. And that means leadership from the highest level. So we've got a situation set up with our parliamentary system where we diffuse the responsibility to the larger bureaucratic ecosystem, so there's no one individual carrying the can. Somebody's got to carry water on these issues, and there's nobody. And so when it goes down into the bureaucracy, it's not my problem. I'm not going to worry about it right now, and therefore we can't move the yardstick. So I do think the latest policy decision in February about not prosecuting Canadians is a great first step, but we need to empower. I don't know which senior bureaucrat it is. It should be, here's an idea, the National Security Advisor, but we can't seem to in this country empower that architecture, is my opinion from what I've seen, and I've seen it time and time and time again, where you go to those meetings and it is a different person every second week. You just can't move the yardsticks down the field.
Americans have a czar, National Security Council, and they also have a fusion cell. So you always have the same people doing the same job, so you have that better understanding. And having dealt with the fusion cell in a couple of recent cases, they're pretty plugged in. They have a pretty good knowledge of what's going on, and they're representative of a whole bunch of different agencies. Having been on the other side of that, you're absolutely right. The longer it goes, the more likely it is that, a year into it, you're going to have entirely different faces. That's just the way the system works. I'm not sure it's a guaranteed fix, but aiming toward that, I think, is a magnificent idea.
Yes, please. Questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, question for both of you gentlemen. With regards to the fact that we live in such a wired world right now, and so much of even our own sort of way of projecting ourselves is through blogs and internet and social media, to what extent does those activities make people more vulnerable to this type of activity? And with a view to not completely shutting oneself off from it, what would be the most prudential thing people should consider with regards to if they're going to be traveling, say, in a year or two to some part of the world where these are problems?
That's a great question. The best answer I can give to that is the commissioner of the OPP recently put out a warning on the internet. He tweeted it out and he said, if you send out a message to everyone on social media, say I'm going to Mexico and your house gets robbed, who's responsible for that? It's sort of the naivete that people have. My family and I are going to, we're going to go to Machu Picchu. Fantastic. Those people are going to look at that and go, what's his net worth? What are their net worth? Can I rob them at home? Can I kidnap them abroad? having care and control of the information about your whereabouts and your well-being and who you're with and, vulnerabilities, I think you make a very, very good point. And again, I think Mr. Hawks put it very well when he said, by announcing it to the world that you're not there, announces to the world that you have a vulnerability. It's, it's very, very common when it's an awful thing to say, but people look at obituaries and when someone passes, they rob the house the day of the funeral. It's because the information is out there. And you need to manage the information and depersonalize it if you can.
And I will add to that, and I don't think I'd be crossing a boundary, Andy or Paul, so if I am, feel free to tackle me. So on a project that we were working with Andy and Paul on about 2 years ago, and talking about our digital footprints, commercially and or nefarious actors have access to a lot of this same commercial software. Andy and Paul and we were working on a challenge within 3 minutes of having the selectors that we needed. We were able to locate an international child abduction situation within 3 minutes. And then over about 90-ish days, we built out a pattern of life to give back to the authorities to help resolve this situation where there was an Interpol red notice on this family. There was a Canadian judicial ruling on it. So if we can do that commercially within 3 minutes, you can well imagine a nefarious actor, criminal gangs, drug cartels, whatever that might be, can do the same thing very quickly. So you need to be very smart with your digital footprint, and there are, again, courses to manage your digital footprint.
Dan,
Any more takers? Yes, General.
speaking of ransoms and all, makes me think of ransomware in the cyber world, and I wondered if that phenomenon is impacting readiness to pay ransoms. I mean, there isn't life at risk. There's substantial wealth and development, and my understanding is that organizations are quite ready to pay ransoms on those things. Does that have any impact?
People have contingency funds to pay that immediately. And with ransomware, and arguably it's a little bit like I was saying, the small end kidnappings that you see in Latin America, they're dealt with very quickly and very, very quietly. Because the downside of even having this take place is, your stock price plummets as soon as that they find out that your company is vulnerable and that someone's holding, extorting you for money. That's why the extortion is paid so quickly, and they don't want to share it with, most private companies don't want to share that information with law enforcement, with security officials, because they don't want it getting out. They don't want to get out that I'm vulnerable. Let's pay it. Let's plug the hole and move on. It's cost of doing business. But it strikes me as being very similar to those. If you're got one of your mining executives been kidnapped and you can quietly deal with it, you do. Those type of kidnappings, the best advice is to keep it out of the media and to deal with it quickly, efficiently, find a price and deal with it. I would suggest that those that are much higher profile, sometimes in order to engage government action, if you're on the side of the family, you need to raise the profile of it a little bit. It's always a delicate game, and it's a dance, and it's a risk. But for the vast proportion, it's best to keep it quiet and move on, just like ransomware.
If there is no other questions, I would like to get back on my hobby horse, if I could, for a moment, to talk about just an example, a personal example. And I come back to why I'm a firm believer from a Canadian perspective, we should be demanding more of our government to modernize and figure out how to solve these problems. And this is a story that's happened more than once. But the second and third order effects of the story is what struck me when I was in War College 7 years after the fact. 7 years after the fact, I'm in the States down at Fort Leavenworth, not in jail, but actually in War College. And it was a story that came all the way back around about Canadians and our lack of willpower. Not our tactical excellence on the battlefield, because there's never been a doubt, as I said earlier, what we do as individuals in various walks of life, Canadians add value everywhere. It's a lack of political and or national strategic willpower. So the story I want to just very quickly relate goes back to the CPT-4 that were grabbed in Baghdad in 2000, it was December of 2005. So there was a number of these folks that were grabbed in Baghdad. I, at the time, happened to have been deployed in Bagram. At the U.S. base up in Bagram, I was the liaison officer to SEAL Team 6. We had our task force down in the south of Kandahar prosecuting the Afghan conflict. I get the call saying, we got a problem. How are we going to resolve this? I went down the hall. We got some Canadians in Baghdad. We are requesting potentially U.S. support. He goes, Steve, I can have you in Baghdad in 6 hours. We've got planes that are shuttling back and forth all the time. I'll put you on that plane within 6 hours so you can get forward with your folks. He goes, I have one request. I want a formal request from the government of Canada for us to support you. I said, yeah, I said, sure, sir. So I sent that back to Ottawa saying, I can be there in 6 hours. So what did I do? I waited 12 hours, waited 18 hours, waited 24 hours, and then finally I got a call from Ottawa. Yeah, Steve, don't worry, you don't need to go. We're going to ask the Brits, and we've already got somebody deploying from Canada, and he'll get there in 72 hours. I said, yeah, roger that. Down the hall and I said, Steve, you guys just don't get it. And what's interesting, when we walk forward to the Fowler Gay case, and we are trying to synchronize the Fowler Gay with the Brits and with the Americans, it was very clear. He says, Steve, I remember 2003, and I remember 2005. I've got a long memory. You guys, you Canadians need to come to the table. And it's not, again, the tactical excellence. It's at that highest level where our closest allies don't believe we'll be there. And that, I think, is completely unacceptable when we look at the men and women that can walk point around this world and do great things if they're just enabled to do it. So I just wanted to finish on that story, if I could, Dan, because I think it's so important as we try and mature the way we work in the 21st century that we need to go to Ottawa and get Ottawa to get out of the Ottawa bubble. Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.